Good morning. It's Tuesday morning. I'm recording this just prior to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. This is Stephen Mullins, Instructional Professor of Meteorology in U.S. Geography Department. This is now Major Hurricane Ian. We are looking at Ian on satellite here, coming off of far western Cuba and edging into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Ian has been strengthening mightily over the last couple of days. We can look at a couple of plots here. The first one is going to be of the minimum sea level pressure in the eye of the storm. So we have here the colored dots, which are when we have the hurricane hunters flying into the storm. When they get to the middle, they drop a sensor called a dropson, and it tells us the raw measurement of what we are getting here. And what we are seeing is that back on Saturday and most of the day on Sunday, we still had these yellow dots here, indicating that our pressures were still fairly high and Ian was not that strong. However, starting on Sunday evening, we had rapid intensification as these dots went from yellows to oranges and into the purples here, where the pressure was deepening down to where they are sitting right about now. And according to the best track, which is the National Hurricane Center telling us where it thinks the center of Ian is and how strong it is. They were recording the last observation this morning as Ian was traveling over the far western Cuba at 950 millibars. So we definitely have a major hurricane strength storm. Also, if we look at this plot, which is showing us an indication of the structure of Ian, which we can see on satellite, this is just a different way of showing it. We are showing that as we are going further in time from Saturday through Sunday and into Monday, now we're edging into Tuesday, not only are the wind speeds getting stronger as the colors are going from the blues and into the purples here, and we crossed into hurricane territory, but also these black lines are showing us how far from the center do we have to go to get to the maximum wind speed. In other words, basically how big is the eye. And we went from Ian as being a weaker storm earlier with an eye that was very large indeed to now that eye is just closing up over time. So now that it's reached major hurricane status, the eye is now something like 20 kilometers wide instead of 40 kilometers wide. So we basically halved how wide the eye is, which has helped make Ian a little bit stronger. So it's a fairly typical eye radius here. And actually, as we looked on satellite, one of the important things to notice is that even though the eye is back here on Cuba, we noticed the clouds extending pretty far to the northeast. And so that shows what I was just showing here for a second, we'll sit on now, is that we are already having a lot of rain impact the southern Florida peninsula. Y'all had the earliest showers yesterday, and it's just going to continue today. And that's going to really precede landfall, and then we're going to have the rain bands also just follow along. And so we're reaching that situation already where we're going to have everywhere in the panhandle basically have 2 days of rainfall. So once again, we have the official forecast that Ian is currently a major hurricane coming off of Cuba and into the far eastern Gulf of Mexico. It is going to remain a major hurricane as it approaches somewhere in the Tampa area. It's going to make landfall as a major hurricane, as the current forecast. So this is going to be a Category 3 storm, and then it's going to move very slowly toward the north. And although the strength of the storm is going to diminish overnight, you're still going to have all of the rain concerns and the wind concerns really anywhere throughout the Florida panhandle, and the threats to what's going to happen along the coast is going to be about the same threat, the same thing that you need to prepare for all the way from the Everglades up through Cedar Key and maybe even Steinhatchee for strong winds and strong storm surge. Now, if we look back over time, what is remarkable, I'm switching to a little bit different view, but just to zoom in on Florida, this is still the National Hurricane Center forecast, but this is the forecast that was issued Saturday morning as a lot of y'all were waking up and thinking that we needed to start to prepare for what to do. And at that time, this is where they thought that Ian would be at 2 a.m. At this point, there was a tropical storm still back in the central Caribbean, and we had landfall somewhere in the Tampa-ish region, but we knew that 5 days out, this storm could be further south, it could be further west. And so all along a huge chunk of the panhandle, we knew that we needed to prepare for potentially a serious storm, because out here we had a major hurricane approaching the Gulf Coast. So this was a very large area that the cone forecast was covering, and it was advisable for everybody starting on Saturday over the weekend to prepare. As we went into Sunday, yes, the models did switch and we went to the west. Now 2 a.m. Thursday was out over the Gulf, and those over Tampa could probably feel a little bit easier, except the problem is that when we went to Monday, the forecast went back over the east and looked a lot like it did back here on Saturday morning. So Saturday morning and Monday morning's forecasts weren't all that much different. It was kind of down the middle of those two forecasts. So now 2 a.m. Thursday is right back somewhere in the vicinity of the Tampa area and making landfall somewhere in central Florida, with once again everywhere along that coast that I originally highlighted needing to prepare for rain, the coast needing to prepare for surge, and everybody needing to prepare for tropical storm winds. And we knew that the greatest chances of hurricane force winds is going to be somewhere along this central Florida area and the Tampa area and south of there. Now the current forecast, so this is the exact same as what I just showed from the National Hurricane Center product, but keeping on this focus, the 2 a.m. On Thursday forecast has landfall somewhere in the Tampa area. And between now and Thursday, this storm could still move a little bit right, a little bit left, which means we're looking at landfall maybe a little bit further south on the coast, maybe further north on the coast. We're not really sure. It's just that the story about who needs to prepare and what y'all need to prepare for is the exact same as it was back on Saturday morning. So that really hasn't changed a whole lot. Just because we have the storm maybe doing a little bit of a left and right, we're still preparing for the winds to bring a whole lot of wind on shore and bring a whole lot of storm surge into the entire coastline from the Everglades on up through at least the Tampa area. And once again, if this track starts to wobble a little back toward the west, that's still going to be true for areas north of Tampa. Nobody's out of the woods. And so as y'all are still in the process of preparing and are finishing up preparations, I think the main message here is you're still doing the exact right thing and to just keep going. And if you're done preparing, then frankly, good job. Now is the time to just, we're just waiting and biding a little bit of time for the storm to arrive here. And so the impact of the forecast, even if it wobbles a little bit throughout the day, you can come back later on tonight or even tomorrow morning, and yeah, there's going to be likely a major hurricane. They're forecasting a Category 4 hurricane as we wake up tomorrow morning, and it's going to be scary. But if you're not someone who needs to leave, maybe you're a little bit further inland, and you don't think that you need to leave, then you can basically know that the forecast as far as its impact on your preparations isn't going to change a ton. So just continue to prepare and continue to enact the plan that you already had. Because when we start looking at risks and get away from just exactly who's going to receive the exact worst conditions, a lot of the things that are true is that a whole lot of people are going to get a ton of rainfall. This is the rainfall forecast from the Weather Prediction Center. There's a ton of the panhandle, all the way from Tallahassee and Jacksonville, all the way down to at least Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades, that are going to get more than 4 inches of rain. Now, yeah, the center part of this has the red and the purples that are anywhere from 10 to 20 inches of rain, and this exact location may change as the track goes a little bit maybe to the right or to the left, but everywhere in this orange and even down to the Everglades, needs to prepare as though that red and purple area could be over you. Your preparation doesn't change. Just because you see yellow here doesn't mean that that's exactly your destiny. It's just the best forecast at this time. And that's been the case since back on Sunday. Also, if we look not just at the amount of rainfall, but at the potential for flash flooding, we see the entire Florida peninsula down here as a moderate level of risk for flash flooding. And nobody's in the high risk area yet, but we know from the history of the Weather Prediction Center issuing this product that something like 85 or 90% of the damage and fatalities from flash flooding comes when areas are in this moderate or high categories here. So the flooding is going to be a very serious situation, and it's not going to depend a lot on exactly where the landfall is going to be. Everybody's going to get a ton of rain, and everybody's going to be at a risk of flash flooding. And the only thing that these panels here on the right is saying is that the risk is going to transfer from the South Florida today up to North Florida a couple of days from now as the storm progresses inland and moves north. Speaking of storm surge, or moving to storm surge, we have big time storm surge everywhere in this orange and red area for upwards of 5 feet and higher. The red and the orange areas are 4 and 5 feet on the lower end, and the only thing that differs is what the higher end can be. So this is a significant issue for the Tampa area and everywhere south. But once again, whether the storm makes landfall in the Tampa area or a little bit south, or even moves a little bit to the left and so therefore makes landfall north, everybody in even the orange area has needed to prepare since the information that we had back on Saturday, as though you're going to get significant storm surge flooding. For houses that are right on the beach, 5 feet is halfway up your first floor. 10 feet is getting into the second floor of a home. And so that's why evacuation orders were issued yesterday. That's why a lot of y'all have already been leaving. And so this forecast, regardless of where the eye exactly goes, doesn't change your preparations that you thought about doing back on Saturday into yesterday. So that covers a lot of the rainfall and the storm surge threats. And then if we move over to the wind threats, I'm going to shift gears a little bit to show a model run. So this is basically giving an idea of where the storm is going to be. This is the center of Ian as it's progressing up to the northeast. But what I want you focusing on is that the green area here is the tropical storm strength winds, the 40 mile per hour winds. And then the core here in the purples and the dark reds are going to be the hurricane force winds of this storm. And so this presents quite a radius for the tropical storm force winds and the hurricane force winds, to where you're not focusing just on the eye. So the Keys are going to get tropical storm force winds out of this. And as we progress this model run forward, as it moves north and progresses toward landfall, everywhere from the Keys up through the Everglades on the right side is getting tropical storm force winds. On the left side, those tropical storm force winds are extending through the Gulf all the way up to Apalachicola. So everywhere from the Keys to Apalachicola are going to see tropical storm force winds. And once again, this doesn't depend on whether the storm makes a little bit left or a little bit of a right jog. Everywhere along this coast is needed to prepare for strong winds. For hurricane force winds, we're looking at everywhere from Fort Myers up through somewhere north of Tampa and thinking about Cedar Key. If this makes a little bit of a right jog, then we're just getting a little bit closer to the Everglades. So a whole ton of folks are going to get the strong winds. And as this makes landfall, you notice that the tropical storm force winds are going to impact those who are inland as well over the Tampa area and south. And this has always been true since the weekend. So even though the wind does weaken over land, the center of the storm is still going to be a powerful thing. Moving forward to the fourth threat, and that is the tornado threat. So this is the Storm Prediction Center who focuses on the tornado threat, and they're showing a slight risk of severe weather in South Florida today, and specifically hovering on this tornado panel here. They're showing a 5% chance of a tornado to be reported within 25 miles of anybody who lives down here. So there's a decent shot of tornadoes in South Florida. And as we move into tomorrow, that threat just progresses into not only south, but up into central and edging into North Florida. And then as we get into, this is now Thursday, the threat just extends off to the East Coast. We're expecting Ian to have made landfall here. And so most of the tornado threat is going to say to the east and northeast side of Ian as it progresses up the Florida Panhandle here. So let's talk a little bit about the actual storm structure here and what's going to be killing the storm. Right now we have we have Major Hurricane Ian coming off of the coast of Cuba. And right now we have these winds. This is up by the top of the atmosphere where planes fly. And all this wind is helping to drive Ian toward the north and toward Florida, like we've been talking about. If we look down at closer to the ground and closer to the ocean at 850, once again, we have a couple of influences on our storm here. We have a ridge off to the east in the Atlantic, and so winds are progressing around that high pressure feature in that way. And then we have a weak but building high pressure over the southern plains, and so we have winds coming around like that. And so on one side of the storm, we basically have 20-mile-per-hour winds, which is from this high over the southern plains. And on the other side of the storm, we have 15 or 20 mile-per-hour winds from the ridge off to the east. So these basically, the influences of these features are basically canceling each other out. And so the winds from the middle and upper of the atmosphere that are driving the storm north are what is in fact helping Ian move north toward Florida. Now the thing that we've always been looking for to basically weaken Ian, regardless of whether it's inland or still out over water about Tampa's latitude and north, is this subtropical jet coming in from northern Mexico and progressing across the northern Gulf of Mexico. And so right now, it is moving eastward toward Ian, but then it turns north at basically this line right here. And what we can see from the hurricane hunters that have been dropping those drop zones, not just in the middle of Ian, but they've been flying really high to get a look at the entire atmosphere at each of these points all the way around the storm itself, but also they flew in a pattern over the over much of the Gulf of Mexico to get all of these points up here. And so what we can see is, in fact, that we do indeed have, just like the model showed, this subtropical jet going west to east across this area and then turning northward. So we had that line, and so we see that in the observations here as well. So right about 24 degrees north, we've got these 20-knot winds and 25-knot winds closer to the hurricane, moving northeast and then north. And if we go back to the model and look about 24 degrees north, we've got back over here 20-knot winds, 20-knot winds, 20-knot winds going north here. So this is showing that the observations are indeed matching what the models have been showing us here. Now, as we progress further in time, what we have is this trough over here and the big old ridge over here, north of Ian, where we're expected to go through Florida and up into Georgia and up the eastern U.S. But these features over time, as Ian progresses toward landfall, start progressing to the east. And so the high and the low move east, and this ridge really builds in, this high pressure really builds in, and you can watch the wind speeds as I go backwards and forwards get a lot stronger on Ian's northwest side. And so back here, we talked about that the winds on the west side of Ian and the winds on the east side of Ian were about the same, and so there wasn't really much of an influence on Ian's speed or direction from the low levels of the atmosphere. But as we went forward in time, and the wind speeds on the west side got a lot stronger here in the darker blues, well, the east side is pretty weak over here. And in fact, if you watch this black line here that's outlining the outskirts of this high pressure, as we go even further toward landfall, it jettisons off to the northeast as well. So we have very strong influence from this high pressure that has moved eastward into the Great Lakes area, with wind coming all the way around it and exerting a lot of really strong winds against Ian, in trying to push against its motion toward the northeast. So now this influence on the bottom of Ian is trying to slow Ian down. That's not true at the top of the atmosphere. As Ian gets closer to landfall, this subtropical jet that we've been talking about is able to progress so that it doesn't just turn northwest of Ian, but now is coming across the top of Ian, continuing to try and push Ian toward the northeast. So at the bottom of the atmosphere, we have an influence trying to push Ian back toward the northwest and slow it down. At the top of the atmosphere, we're moving to the northeast and trying to keep it going up the Florida Peninsula. These influences basically cancel out, and so that's why Ian is slowing down as it approaches landfall and the Florida Panhandle. So that's basically the look at the forecast here. Once again, we still have Ian looking to make landfall somewhere in that Tampa-ish area. It may wind up being further south. It might wind up being further north. But once again, as we discussed earlier, everybody from the Everglades up through Cedar Key and on around into Steinhatchee has to prepare for very strong winds, quite a bit of storm surge, especially if you're in the Tampa area for sure. All of the preparations that you've probably been doing since the weekend still apply. And so the biggest tip that I have for you right now is to just continue with your plan of preparing and either leaving if you've been ordered to, or hunkering down. With that, everybody stay safe through the rest of the week. Keep track of who does need aid the most, and look for places where you can give money so that you can help out in those areas. Things often get piled up and not used, but money can be used for anything, and money is always the best thing to send into an area.